Hello everybody, welcome to today's AAA Wildlife Hazard Management webinar. Just very quickly, I'll be starting off with some housekeeping matters, but and then also introduce our speaker today. For any technical assistance that you might require, please do phone Redback support. Redback Conferencing is the company handling today's teleconference. They can be reached on 1800 733 416. If you'd like to listen to the webinar through your phone instead, if you can dial in the number and passcode that's listed in the chat box there for you as well. Welcome again. Today is the first of a series of webinars that the AAA is pleased to present and will be made available to all of our members. We're delighted to kick off this program, and we do encourage you to provide feedback after the completion of the webinar, in particular for any additional topics that you might like to see in additional webinars that are held. So today's webinar is on interpreting wildlife behaviour for effective management, and it's presented today by Dr. Jeff McKee, who's Director of Research and Development at Abbey Shaw. Jeff has 30 years of experience as a wildlife veterinarian and a commercial pilot. He has been involved with aviation wildlife hazard management for the past 20 years. He is a member of the Wildlife Disease Association and of the International Society of Air Safety Investigators. Jeff is currently a partner and director of R&D at Abbey Shaw. To ask Jeff a question, please use the chat box, which is located on the left-hand side of your screen, just to the right of the cogwheel. After typing in out your question, hit enter to submit, and questions will be answered accordingly. So there are also some resources attached to this session. Should have been in the email that was sent, the reminder email that went around as well. But they are, in particular, the AAA's Airport Practice Note 6, which is species management plans. I'd encourage you to have a look at those as well. Before we do start, though, I'll take the opportunity to provide a special thanks to Jeff in particular, but also to Abbey Shaw for your continued support. For more information on Abbey Shaw's service offering, and in particular their training course, I'd encourage you to jump on their website, which is www.avisure.com. Also, before we do kick off, just like to mention that a quick reference to tomorrow and the following days, Australian Aviation Wildlife Hazard Group workshop, which is being held in Brisbane. It will include a tour of a flying fox roost, which is kind of interesting, ibis colony and a waste facility, along with a full program of sessions and group discussions. So if you haven't already or you're not aware of that particular event, I'd encourage you to go to their website, aawhg.org. Also quickly, just a quick sell on our online training course that's now available. So you can jump on the AAA's education training website, which is airporteducation.asn.au. We've got a Wildlife Hazard Management Essentials training course that's been released recently, which you may be interested in as well. And finally, for those members looking at coming to our national conference later this year, the early bird cut-off date is fast approaching. So that's on the 28th of July. So if you are keen on registering for a conference, I'd encourage you to jump on our conference website, airportsconference.asn.au, to check out the program and register. So with all that said, I won't take up any more of your time, but thank you again for participating, everybody, and I'll now hand over to Jeff to commence today's webinar.
Thanks, Nick. I'm transmitting at the moment. Can you hear? Hello?
Yep, I can hear you fine there, Jeff.
Excellent, right. Okay, well, welcome everybody, and thanks, Nick, for your introductory word. And welcome to this inaugural webinar hosted by the AAA for air safety purposes. And I think myself that it's entirely appropriate that this first webinar should be around the issue of wildlife strike. Now, wildlife strike in Australia is still, and in many parts of the world, is still the most significant cause of occurrence or incident to RPT aircraft. It rarely causes a huge safety issue, but it's a huge cost both to the aviation industry and to the wildlife itself. And so I think it's good that we can launch into the webinar series to look at some aspects of this issue and how we might better manage it. It's also one of the only aviation safety issues. It's a bit of an orphan in the industry at the moment, which is increasing in incidents. And I suppose that's just a reflection of how poorly as an industry worldwide that we handle this particular problem. Before we start into the meat of the issue, who are we and what do we do? Well, as Nick said, I'm Director of Research and Development for a company called Abbey Shaw. We're an Australian-based company. We started under a different name, EcoShore, about 25 years ago as a very small company. We're now global with offices in Australia, most of the capital cities in Australia, with offices in South America, offices in North America, and projects in those countries. We work in the defence industry in Australia and the civil aviation industry right around the world. We have major collaborators and not so much projects at the moment, but collaborations, R&D type collaborations and policy collaborations with people in the United States and in Europe. And we're very, very passionate about this issue. Our goal originally, back probably 10 years ago, was to really nail this issue, to almost solve the problem, if you like. We'll never stop strike completely, but to really put in place a series of procedures within the industry which would just make it go away. We had hoped to do that by 2020. I think that was a little optimistic. We sort of revised that estimate. We might get out to about 2030. And it's good that the topic today is on behaviour, because we're going to be addressing wildlife behaviour primarily, but it's the human behaviour which is the big blocker. And we'll leave that for a discussion at another webinar. Today, just an overview of what we're going to talk about. I'm going to start off with defining the wildlife strike issue, and probably defining it in a way that you might not be used to. Once we've defined it, we can then say, well, how are we going to manage it? So we'll define a management aim, and we'll look at the general management options we have. We'll then go on to look at the general principles for assessing animal behaviour. Now, the bulk of this talk is going to be on the animal behaviour aspect, but there's no way we can get across to you in 40 minutes a sort of a lifetime of animal behaviour management. Main aim here, and the takeaway message here, is to get you to maybe think about managing wildlife in different ways and observing them so that you can manage them in much more efficient ways. And we're just trying to give you a taste at this stage of how that process works, and hopefully get you enthusiastic about it. And if you want to go on for specific cases afterwards for your aerodromes, we can talk to you via email. We'll then, after talking about the general principles of assessing animal behaviour, we'll go through some case studies, and these are real situations, real animals, of how we could apply our knowledge of behaviour of those specific animals to reducing the conflict rate between aircraft and the wildlife. And then at the end, and this is probably going to be the most important part, certainly for me, will be the question and answer and discussion session. I know there'll be many of you out there in the audience who have years of experience doing this on aerodromes, and I'm sort of really keen and enthusiastic to listen to you guys and your experiences and learn from you as well. What is the true nature of the airstrike problem, the wildlife strike problem? Now, we're used to considering this, and this is the way the legislation is framed, Part 139 of the MOS, and even Annex 14 at ICAO level. We're used to considering this as an airport issue. But it's not really an airport issue, is it? When we look at it in its basic elements, we've got a block of airspace represented by the rectangle there, and that block normally goes up to about 3,000 foot AGL. That's above ground level. That's the limit of the strike zone, or generally speaking. It varies from place to place, but that's what we consider the average limit of the strike zone. And in that block of airspace, we're going to have wildlife and I include takeoff and landing here, so ground strikes or ground animals, we're going to have aircraft and wildlife interacting. And if we look at it in its simplest way, the probability of a strike in that block of airspace is proportional to the number of aircraft in there, or the number of aircraft movements, and the number of wildlife. Very straightforward, very simple. And also, it's going to be dependent on the ability of aircraft and wildlife to avoid each other. Now, in this day and age, apart from probably the helicopter flight, there's virtually no see and avoid in this issue. The closing speeds, as you well know, are just too big. Wildlife generally don't have enough time to get out of the way, and pilots rarely see wildlife before they're struck. So straight away, when you look at it in this context, it's not an airport issue. It's an airspace issue, and it's an in-flight collision in the airspace issue. And I think as an industry, and we as participants in that industry, need to start looking at it in that context, more so than as almost a static FOD issue on an airport. We're managing in-flight collisions, or trying to manage them, and it's very difficult, as many of you know. Now, the other side to this equation is the consequence of a strike. Okay, so risk is probability times consequence. Probability depends on what's there. The consequence depends more upon the mass of the striking objects, and in this case, the mass of the birds or the mass of the wildlife being struck. The greater the mass, the greater the consequence, the higher the risk. So there we have it. We've got an aircraft flying in this airspace, wildlife flying in this airspace colliding. Well, that's what we're trying to prevent. We're trying to avoid in-flight collision. And so when you think about it, it's all about managing the behaviour of both the pilot, aircraft, and the wildlife. We have to understand that behaviour in order to keep the flight paths separate. And we have to understand the behaviour because that's telling us about what is motivating both the aircraft and the wildlife to be flying along those particular flight paths. Okay, so behaviour leads to motivation. And the things that motivate wildlife, okay, tend to be food, water, reproductive capability, etc., etc. We'll talk about those more later. So understanding those motivations tells us why the wildlife is there, and then gives us a wedge into changing those motivations to change that flight path. Not always possible, but that's the process that we're going to go down. Okay, so from a management perspective, our aim is to separate the animal flight path from the aircraft flight path. And the main instrument that we use to do that is the Wildlife Hazard Management Program, and that has a whole series of general management options. So we can manage the habitat on the airport or off the airport in order to change the flight path of wildlife around the critical airspace. We can actually train animals or train wildlife if we're good enough at understanding their behaviour to move their flight paths in certain directions, and we can also train ourselves to understand this better. That's part of what we're doing now. We can investigate our strikes more thoroughly, and we're doing trying to do a lot more of this at the moment within the company, is to do significant strike investigations. Because the question you're always trying to answer there with a strike investigation is, why was that aircraft and that wildlife trying to occupy the same space at the same time? In other words, what was the motivation for them being there, so that we can then go back and stop them being there in the future. We can simply monitor the hazards that are operating in critical airspace. We can monitor the amount and numbers of wildlife going through your critical airspace, and we can communicate that hazard level, if you like, to flight crew, who can then change their flight paths to avoid the collision process. And we're trying to do a lot in the background at the moment of convincing aircrew to pay more attention to this process. We can also communicate that monitored hazard or those hazard levels to the wildlife control officers or wildlife control officers associated with the aerodrome, and then they can move into a dispersal phase. And probably most important of all in thinking about management is this idea of a rolling risk assessment. This is not FOD, it's not static. the risk is changing all the time in the airspace from minute to minute, just like the wind speed and the direction are changing. And we need to be aware of that in our hazard management process. So in summary, we assess the animal behaviour to select the appropriate management, changing that behaviour and avoiding an in-flight collision. We assess the animal's behaviour to assess which of those general categories we're going to use to try and manage that behaviour. We often use more than one approach. Understanding the wildlife behaviour is essential to which of these approaches are best, and it's essential to being able to assess whether that approach has actually worked or not as you're going along. We're watching the animal's behaviour all the time. And it's essential to being able to adapt the management plan to meet the animal's response if it's not responding properly. Some general rules of thumb and consideration for assessing animal behaviour. I'll put this slide up here because it's quite unusual. We don't often see elephants swinging lizards. And I saw this on the web the other day and I thought, what on earth is that animal doing? What is motivating that animal to do that? And yeah, well, I haven't quite worked it out yet. I'm wondering whether it's a Photoshop thing or not. But having done some work with elephants before in the past, it wouldn't surprise me. The animal's probably bored. Okay, some general rules of thumb. Behaviours are generally species dependent. Okay, so a magpie will behave in a certain way with a certain response to a stimulus, but an ibis will behave in a completely different way to the same stimulus. And behaviours are intimately linked to the anatomy and the physiology, the form and function of the species we're dealing with. And if we go back to the photo there, we can look at that elephant and say, okay, it's very unlikely that this is going to exhibit any form of flight behaviour. It just doesn't have the form or function to be able to do that. So form, function, anatomy, physiology, and species, behaviours are intimately linked to that. Behaviours are also context dependent. So we can have the same species with the same stimulus, but the behaviour will be different in a different context, a different location, a different climate, etc. And one of the best examples of this are the killer whales which circle in large pods around the Antarctic rim. They're divided into different behavioural groups. Some feed exclusively on whales, some feed exclusively on seals and penguins, some feed exclusively on sharks and fish. And the ones that feed on seals and penguins, they don't even recognise fish as a food source. So how those, and that sort of leads us into another area too. Behaviours then are not fixed. They can change over time. And that change allows the animal to adapt better to a changing environment. One of the best examples of behavioural change in Australian wildlife over the last 30 years is the Australian white ibis. And anybody who's from the east coast, from north to south, will recognise that white ibis have moved into the coastal urban areas over the last 30 years in big numbers. So while they've done that, they've completely changed their nesting behaviour, their breeding behaviour, their feeding behaviour to adapt to the new environment. Quite a massive change, and in doing so, they've really elevated themselves up the list of high strike risks. We look at behaviour, or we try and analyse behaviour to determine what the animal's motivation is. Okay, animals tend to be motivated by food, resources, water resources, a search for shelter, a search for security or a safe haven from predators, by reproductive advantage or reproductive actions. And one thing that they're also animals, and it's often left out of the list, and it comes back to the photo that's on this page, that animals are often motivated out of curiosity or exploratory behaviour. And I'm wondering if that's what's going on here with this elephant and this lizard. That is a really, really important component, this curiosity or exploratory behaviour, because again, that's part of the ability of a species to change its behaviour in response to a changing environment. Now, if we think of these things as our baseline when we're trying to move into this area of behavioural management, that's basically what you've got. The main take-home message: nothing is fixed in stone. Always be prepared for the unusual, or the elephant swinging the lizard. How do we go about assessing behaviour? Again, I can give you some quick rules of thumb here. You need to be keen observers. You need to watch things very, very closely. And ideally, take the time to document these observations so you can keep a record of what's going on. You're looking at a particular species in the context of your aerodrome, what it's doing. You're trying to work out why it's doing it. First steps first, you need to be very, very precise about what it's actually doing, and then do the analysis. Don't sort of preempt its motivations. Don't jump directly to, oh, it's looking for food. Organise in your head what it's doing, then why it's doing. And in the context of your aerodrome, we're going to use this analysis to try and then remotivate the animal so that its flight path changes, so that it's no longer in your critical airspace. That's not always possible. So if you can't do that, we use the analysis to predict the animal's future flight path or likely flight path, and then notify that information so that the aircraft can change its flight path. Okay, so that's the baseline stuff that we're looking at here. We'll now look at a few case studies about how, which will give you some clues about how to put this into practice. And I can't make a template for you. It's different every time. It's different with different species. It's different with different contexts. And you have to rely on your experience and your judgment to be able to assess what's going on and make a management plan. We're going to look at a species in terms of foraging and tracking behaviour. We're going to look at one in terms of its reproductive and territorial behaviour, one in terms of its flight and escape behaviours. Another, if we get that far down the track, which we may not, we'll look at in terms of its predatory and security behaviours. And I don't think we'll get to the initial flight responses, but we may. What species we're going to look at, I've selected this basically on the latest ATSB summary of what are your major risks, what are the major risks in Australian aviation, our major strike risks. And I've determined the major strike risks, not so much on the number of strikes, but on the number of damaging strikes that have occurred between 2006 and 2015. And we're going to start off with our old friend, the flying fox. And it's by far probably the highest risk species in Australia at the moment. Certainly the highest number struck is flying foxes, and the highest number of damaging strikes is flying foxes. And that again, it's only occurred really over the last 20 years. And if you go back 30 or 40 years, flying foxes were rarely struck. And again, it's got to do with changing environment, changing behaviour as a result of that changing environment. We'll then look at some, further down the list here, at some behaviours associated with shorebirds and with masked lapwings, the old favourite. Everybody in Australia that's ever been on an airport has probably been charged by a plover, a spur-wing plover or a masked lapwing, and their behaviours are quite unique. And then if we get a chance, we'll have a look at one case study involving a terrestrial animal, a strike risk, a land animal incursion. These are usually, and should be usually, fairly easily managed, but you can run into trouble managing terrestrial animals if you don't think about it, and this is a good example of one of those cases. Okay, let's look at flying foxes now. Most of you are probably familiar with these guys. Unless you come from somewhere south and west of Adelaide, everybody's probably seen them operating in the environment or operating around their airport. And let's look at some of their behaviours or some of their qualities which help define, firstly, their risk status, and then help us define how we're going to manage them. So there's a number of different species in Australia that are of note. There's probably 4 major flying fox species that we put into strike risk categories. There's other related species that aren't. And the first thing you'll notice about these guys, they're crepuscular, nocturnal. Crepuscular meaning they tend to operate around first and last light, nocturnal operate at night. Straight away, that behaviour should raise alarm bells in your mind. Okay, if they're operating in the dark, we can't see them. Very difficult to manage. They're frugivorous. That means they eat fruits and flowers and nectar and things, and that means they're going to have to move around to find out what's flowering and fruiting at the time if they're going to get any food. And that brings us to their next main behaviour, it's their nomadic. Okay, and flying foxes will range up to 50 kilometres per night in search of food, often different directions, anywhere around where they're roosting, and up to about 2,000 kilometres in a season. They can move right across continental scales. And that again should raise alarm bells. If you see that sort of behaviour in an animal, you're going to have to think to yourself, if I'm going to manage this animal, my management strategies have to be applied at roughly the same scale. So if you're managing or trying to manage flying foxes around your airport, you've got to be thinking in that 50 kilometre at least scale around your airport to apply effective management. They're communal and flocking, so they roost in great numbers and flock in great numbers, up to 250,000 at a time, which puts them right up the scale into the red line on terms of strike risk, because it's going to be a high mass multiple strike if you fly your aircraft through a mob of 150,000 or so that are flying out of a roost site at night. Their flight characteristics, their flight behaviour, they generally fly fairly slow, around about cruising speed, airspeed around 10, 15 knots. They're very stable in flight, the way they're set up, which means they're not very manoeuvrable. So they're not very good at avoiding things quickly in flight. One thing in their favour, which gives us a bit of a handle on how to manage it, is that they do have semi-predictable flight paths. And what I mean by semi-predictable is that they tend to block out at during a certain time period, and that's at 1 hour before, 1 hour after last flight. And so that's semi-predictable. So we've got a bit of a handle on when we should be looking for this risk and then when we should be managing it. When they travel, remember these guys, they're like pilots. They're always looking for the easy way out. They're always looking for how to conserve fuel during flight. Flight in mammals is a really high energetic consumption behaviour, and they want to minimise their energy loss. So they will try and fly in the shortest direction, the shortest straight line direction between their roost site and their foraging site, and they will try and select a level which gives them the best tailwind component or the least headwind component. So they might go up to 1,000 foot or so to get a good tailwind, and they might hunker right down to a 50-foot AGL to get a bit of to get out of the headwind if they need to go in that particular direction. So they're very, very single-minded, travelling in large groups, and very loath to change direction. Let's have a look now at some of their behaviours in real life, or at least their roost-leading behaviour. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. There was a large group of flying foxes, probably a couple 100,000, leaving their roost at end of daylight. And you'll notice they get up above the roost and they swirl around and they go in multiple directions in large groups, probably getting themselves orientated or communicating with their scout. And then after a period of time, they'll set off and usually track out in not just one direction, and there might be 2 or 3 set tracks that they'll head off along to get to 2 or 3 different foraging sites. Most, as you saw in that, will stay probably below 100, 200 foot AGL. You can certainly see the risk associated to aircraft that would be operating at 200 to 300 feet AGL if one of these flying fox flight paths intersected that aircraft flight path. Okay, so how do we put all this together, all this look at their look at their behaviour, and how do we put it together into some sort of cohesive management. And I picked this one straight up because this one's one of the hardest. This species is one of the hardest to manage because of the qualities we outlined earlier. Okay, so first off the tab in our hands anyway, and if anybody's got any variation on this, I'm looking forward to hearing it. In our hands, dispersal, putting up flares and shooting and doing all that sort of thing and noises has not been very effective. We are looking at some ways of trying to change their flight paths in flight like that, with very little success at the moment, but we might have some further news on that in a couple of years' time. So dispersal, in conventional dispersal, means we haven't found effective. The first thing you need to do as an airport is identify and remove any of the plant species that these things eat on airport and get rid of them altogether. That's the first thing you can do, is just keep them from tracking directly to your airport and eating stuff there. Pretty straightforward. And the only other thing that you're left with really is to have a notification system. Okay, we've got flying foxes coming across. They're likely to come across tomorrow night, but during these periods, okay, we've got people out there watching them. We've got the track, their number, the estimated mass going through the airspace at any one time, the direction, the height, and then a flight management process. So we can transfer that information through ATC to aircrew, and aircrew can they can change their flight paths accordingly. That's basically what we're left with at the moment. And I know there's a number of airports around Australia at the moment, and forgive me if I leave someone out, but Cairns in particular for many years, Brisbane also, Ballina is another one, Gold Coast, have quite sophisticated and workable notification systems for this very purpose. And airlines are starting to take up the challenge a little bit. They're carrying holding fuel during flying fox peak season, so they can come in and hold for 30 minutes and wait for the streams of the animals to dissipate before trying to land through them. There are, however, other ways that we can manage this problem, and they're not ways that we're used to thinking about. Now, these are long-term management solutions, okay? And it's operating at that larger regional scale that I alluded to earlier. We need to start managing the landscape in order to manage their flight paths. We need to change the geometry between the foraging areas, the critical airspace or the airport, and their roost sites. And we need to do that over a long period of time because it's not going to happen quickly. To do this, we need to drag in councils, we need to drag in wildlife authorities, we need to drag in government, and we need to do it in a coordinated, multidisciplinary and collaborative way. And if we put these things into practice now, in 20 years' time, we won't have this problem. Let me give you a sort of a hypothetical example of what we're talking about here. Now, here's a landscape, a city landscape on an estuary, coastal, mountains in the background, and just this little area here represents an airport. It's got two parallel runways and a cross strip. And the red lines that I put in there represent the approach paths for each of these runways. So this going into here would be 27 right, 27 left, 09 right, 09 left. Okay, so they're the critical airspace paths, if you like, that we have to be cognizant of. Now, we'll put in a couple of flying fox roost sites in these little black cylinders here, one here and one here. I just choose random sites. And let's say, for the argument, that there's a couple of 100,000 flying foxes in each of these sites. And every night, these guys are going to race out into the landscape, out to about 50 kilometres, looking for food. Okay, and they would have scouted out where that food is. And for the sake of this analysis, we'll put in a couple of flowering sites. So 1, 2, 3 flowering sites that are current at the moment. This is where they're heading to. Now, clearly, if we look at the northern roost site, okay, animals will be going from the roost site to these flowering sites fairly close by. And I think, in general, you can see that their flight paths are not going to conflict with the airport flight paths in this particular scenario. So that roost site's going to be out of play. But these guys here are also going to be heading off to those flowering sites and looking for food. And when you look at their track, assuming they're straight line, okay, it's going to look something like this. And when you look harder, this flowering site here and this flowering site here, they're going to be tracking off there. And normally speaking, you'd have to analyse it at the time, but normally speaking, they'd be tracking underneath the glide slope here for each of those runways. But this one here is problematic, or could be problematic. You can see that short final here and mid final here are going to be compromised or possibly compromised by flying foxes tracking to and from this particular forage site under this circumstance. Okay, let's say now that these sites stop flowering and we end up with another flowering site down here to the south. Okay, the opposite is going to occur now. This particular roost site will be out of conflict with aircraft flight paths down low, but this one over here is going to probably conflict with both approach and departure corridors of both runways, with animals tracking to and from there. Okay, so this sort of analysis that we're involved with at the moment for a number of different reasons, for public health reasons as well as aircraft reasons in a few different areas, and trying to develop a model for how these animals are using the airspace, when and where, so that we can change the way in which they do that. So, okay, let's look at this foraging site here and this one here. Okay, let's say we send out council guys to chop down all the fruiting trees in those foraging sites there now and make it a lot less attractive to foraging. And then for the sake of conservation balance, I suppose, let's make garner over time some foraging plant species in this area and this area to replace that lost habitat. You can see by moving that geometry around between the foraging sites, flight paths, geometry around between the foraging sites, flight paths, and the roost sites, we've now taken virtually all the tracks out of play of being in conflict with the aircraft moving. Now this is that large-scale behavioural pattern driving this sort of thinking, and it's long-term thinking. And we really need to get airports, but councils and state governments thinking this way in order to manage all the problems, not just the air safety problems, but all the problems associated with flying foxes in urban areas. For the sake of time, I think I'm going to leave this guy out, and I'm going to talk about just running a little bit short on time at the moment. So I'm going to talk about gunman and flight behaviour. Okay, so flying foxes, right? This is a different problem now. We're looking at shorebirds, and many of you who will come from airports around the coastal areas of Australia will periodically have large influxes of shorebirds or waving migratory shorebirds into the area. And if you do, you'll know that they can be a pain in the neck to try and manage and to work out what it is they're actually doing. Most of these guys are pretty small in actual size, not like flying foxes, which are up around a kilogram. These little guys here are Dunlin, and they're around about 50 grams or so. So as an individual strike, they don't represent a huge air safety risk. But they do hang around in large flocks. They have highly maneuverable flight characteristics. They're just like little jet fighters. They have extremely advanced predator avoidance behaviour, and we'll have a look at that in a second. And what these guys do, they tend to feed on tidal flats as the tide's out, and in small shallow pools of water, like this guy here in the photograph. And they feed on mollusks and invertebrates and worms and things quite happily. They're pretty indiscriminate. They'll eat just about anything of that size range. And what happens when the tide comes in is that they'll tend to move inland and start loafing in and around on the inland foreshore areas. Let's have a look at their particular behaviour, particularly their flight and escape behaviour in response to a predator, because this determines, A, in some ways, why they're so risky when they get up and airborne, and B, it gives us a bit of a handle on how we're going to manage them.
It is just each bird following a few basic rules. 1. Steer to avoid crowding local flock mates. 2. Steer towards the average heading of local flock mates. 3. Steer towards the average position of local flock mates. This behavior is very important for survival of birds such as dunlin. There is no leader, no overall control. The behavior belongs to the group. A dive-bombing falcon can't focus on an individual within a flock, and the falcon risks injury due to collision. Its best chance for a meal is to find a laggard or separate an individual from the flock. In this video, from the second dive of the peregrine to the final landing of the dunlin was one continual shot. Let the dance begin.
Okay, I hope you saw that, and I hope you heard the soundtrack. That is absolutely magnificent behaviour. The way that they can fly in formation with such manoeuvrability, the way that they almost disappear into the background as they turn, and different parts of their body reflect different parts of the light. It's a huge adaptation to avoid the predator. It confuses the predator, finds it very difficult to then nail one in the flock and eat one. Okay, as you can imagine, though, those things operating in your airspace around an airport, particularly if they're preoccupied with the predator, can be quite a risk in large numbers. Now, these guys at this airport, now this is not a hypothetical, this is a real example now, it's a North American airport. These guys tend to operate at certain times of the year as they're migrating through this area, and they primarily forage along these tidal flats, these estuarine tidal flats here. Okay, the tide goes in and out a long way here, and they become exposed very quickly. Now, if we look closely now at the airport, there's runway, we're looking at 09 left and 09 right, and the cross strip here. At this particular airport, when the tide comes in and it races in here, they have nowhere to go. So what they tend to do, they tend to jump over here, and they tend to alight and loaf in this area here next to the intersection of the runways, the cross strip. And the reason they seem to do that, or at least one of the reasons they seem to do that, is when it rains, and it rains often here, you tend to get a little pooling of water through these grassed areas here at the intersection, and that brings up worms and invertebrates and stuff, so that not only can they escape the tide, they can go to an area where they're getting more food resource. And that's what a mob of a couple of thousand of dunlins sitting on the runway look like. Not look like much, but when they get airborne and they're all sucked into an engine at one time, it can cause havoc. And when it does happen, and it has happened at the airport on numerous occasions, the amount of fog blown out the back of the engine means that the runway is contaminated for long periods of time and actually closed. 9 times out of 10, that's not a problem, because the cross strip is rarely used, and it's only used when the wind is in the appropriate direction and the main skips can't be used for whatever reason. But still, it's a significant issue for this particular airport, and they had to come to grips with some ways of managing it. So how did they manage it? How did they come to grips with it? Okay, so this is a pictorial representation of the immediate management procedures that they put in place. They used to try and shoot them, they used to try and disperse them, but it didn't seem to work very well. And when we took over managing here, we had a look at the problem, and we noted, if we go to the top left-hand picture here, that there were a couple of wild peregrine falcons operating on the airside area at this time. Now, prior to this, any falcons like that were operating around the airport, they shoot them. And we said, hang on, let's work with these guys. These are their natural predators. These are what's really going to lift them off the ground to start off with and make that airside area a lot less attractive to them. Why don't we try and preserve the falcons and encourage them in the airside environment, balance the risk of a falcon getting struck against 1,000 gunmen getting struck. And let's see how that goes. So the falcon stayed, and there's one over falcon there who's got a carcass on one of the taxiways there. We tried to not to encourage them to keep their carcasses on the taxiways, but he didn't pay any attention, this guy. So that's looking through the airport spotting scope. And so first step off the rank is we're keeping the falcons. The next, a more directed and more coordinated tactical approach is that we have falconers who put falcons or eagles up for this very deterrent purpose on command, and they can come back. So they're a lot less of a risk in their own right. So we're using that highly advanced predator response as the main behavioural method for trying to manage these guys as well. So we've got the background, we've got the falcons, and in the foreground we've got the falconry experts dealing with the problem. Now, it's not just enough to get that group of gunmen airborne at the runway intersection. In fact, that can be actually make things worse if you don't do something more about it. So when these guys come in, at the same time we've got these guys patrolling the area, another type of predator in the area which makes it less attractive, and at the same time we'll have a couple of wildlife control guys with pyrotechnics. So this is done in a coordinated advance. So we're not just lifting those birds up and placing them somewhere else on the airside area, we're lifting them up and trying to move them on right off the airside area. Okay? And remember, we can time this. We can time this with the tide because that's the main problem, and only at certain times of the year when they're migrating through the area. The rest of the time they're not there. And then following that tactical response up, we sometimes put out remotely activated, they're not on a set cycle, we can remotely activate them, gas cannons. You know, these guys at them, the dog patrolling the area, the wild falcon patrolling the area, and a gas cannon strategically going off if it looks like they're going to settle there anywhere. And it's unfortunate, but it does require that much effort to try and push these guys into a situation where they're no longer a collision risk with the aircraft. Difficult type of thing. So that's the tactical side of things. What about the strategic side of things? Because there's a couple of other things that they're going to try and instigate at the airport over a long period of time to reduce this risk. So they're the two tactical things that we just discussed. And one is to, if you can think back to that foreshore area, which is intertidal, next to the end of the runways there, at the undershoot of 09, try and reclaim some of the land there to bring it up above the highest tide level so that they have a refuge back in the intertidal zone away from the tide. And because these guys tend to operate low, again, that's another way of trying to avoid the thrust of the falcon, if we can keep them loafing at high tide back in that intertidal zone on a refuge island, if you like, then we can keep them well underneath the flight path and they'll just settle there. So that's one thing. And of course the obvious thing is let's try and improve the drainage at the runway intersection to prevent pooling water there, and that area becomes less attractive to them during those high tide regions. Okay, so that brings us to around about our time now. A couple of other examples here we can discuss with people later. One to do with coyotes on the runway and burrowing animals, terrestrial animals. And then the final one is to do with, let's train pilots in wildlife behaviour so they can make reasonable assessments as to what wildlife are going to do and avoid them, which some of you may have seen before in different fora. But I think I'll leave it there, and we'll go ahead now with any questions that you might have along these lines, or any things any comments you'd like to make, or further things you'd like to discuss. Thanks. So guys, if you do have any questions, do take the opportunity to
to pop in a message in the chat box. Jeff is here to answer any questions you might have. So yeah, please do jump in if you have any. I think Kasim has a question there, Jeff, about what about protected species?
Yeah, well, I suppose that's always, Kasim, that's always one of the considerations in your management plan for a species. And it's also what we encourage people to keep a track of in their yearly log of how their management plan is going, okay? Have they actually come across any protected species? Have they inadvertently or otherwise killed some protected species? Because they're sort of key performance indicators. How we go about that? Well, basically, the whole thing hinges on your ability to correctly identify what you're trying to manage. If your species identification is no good, you're going to run into troubles with this. So first step one in your training is make sure that you really understand how to identify them, how to identify the protected species. You then really need, before you start racing into management with these guys, you need to liaise with your local wildlife authorities and see what sort of protections or what sort of management plan is available overall for that species if it's endangered or vulnerable or otherwise. And then you liaise with those guys to get a permit to manage it in some way, and obviously you try and manage it as non-invasively as possible. In other words, culling is the last resort. You cull if it's an absolute necessity for air safety. Otherwise, you think about ways of trying to motivate it away from the aircraft. Did that answer the question, Kasim?
Probably just while Kasim's maybe popping a response in there, we might just see if there's another question there about Magpie Management as well. Jeff, any ideas there?
Yeah, Magpie's a huge thing. I don't know whether I've been to too many airports in Australia where I haven't seen magpies. And they're always an issue. The thing about magpies is they're smart. They're really smart, and you can actually train them. And you're a lot better trying to get a nice, trained, resident lot of magpies in your airport environment, of older, stable magpies in your environment, who are filling up that environment. If you start shooting them all willy-nilly, you just get more coming in and filling up the space, more that aren't going to be as airport savvy as the guys that are there. But our experience is try and put the time and the effort into training those magpies to respond to you. They get to know you. You're hassling them all the time and just letting them know that you're there, so they're more vigilant. So they're less likely to get hit by an aircraft, and they're filling up that space which would otherwise fill up by new birds coming in. The thing there is that you do need to cull from time to time, so try and keep your culling specific for the juveniles coming through, because they're generally as silly as wheels anyway, and they're much more likely to be struck. That's a very quick resume on magpies and management on airports from our perspective, and certainly if you want to go into more detail, we could discuss it offline at some stage. There's another question there from Heather, which seems to support what I just said, which is really good. Okay, so Heather's just made a question, a comment that they have 3 very smart families of magpies that live on our grass airfield. They don't get hit. They've learned how to work with us and to keep others away. We love them and encourage them to stay. Thanks, Heather. Great. Another question from Paul, observations on Pacific gulls. Big birds. Personally don't have a great deal of experience with them. Some of our guys down in Victoria and the southern states do. I'm sorry, I can't really help you out there. I'll just see if there's anybody here that, in our audience here at work, anybody specific goals? No, not really, but all I can say is, like any species, if you've got an issue with these guys, you need to work out why they are conflicting your airspace. Are they transiting? Are they something on the airfield that they're responding to or attracted to? With silver gulls, generally here on the east coast, they will come in and use the airfield as a refuge during bad weather, and particularly again, like those other shorebirds, the dunlins, they'll use it if you've got pooled water accumulating in wet times on your grass areas. That really is a big attractant. For the Pacific gulls, not sure.
So we've probably got time for a couple more questions. There's one more there, Jeff, from Glenn.
Yep. I'll just address that now. That's a good one, actually. Glenn's question is, can you comment on getting community support for off-airport environmental manipulation to support the airport operation? There are many are against disturbing flying fox roosts. Yes. Okay. This is particularly pertinent for the flying fox issue right up and down the east coast of Australia. And all I can say to that one is we need to get the airports into cahoots with the councils, into cahoots with the state government. We need to get liaison between public health authorities in particular, animal health authorities also, because we're not just talking here about the airspace issue. We're talking about emerging infectious diseases, Hendra virus in horses, Lissa virus and Hendra viruses spilling over into human populations, causing havoc. And there's a series of other conservation issues associated with flying foxes, as well as the public health, as well as the airport issues. And we have tried, and we are continuing to try to get, at a state government level in particular, collaborative committees, if you like, not that committees tend to do much, but at least it's a start point of these groups into place so that we can manage flying foxes much more productively. So it is happening, and I suppose the best thing you could do is to lobby your local member and say, hey, we want this, we want to deal with this problem. We want to deal with all these problems in a coordinated fashion. In regards to that, we've just reviewed for Coffs Harbour, I think it was, a local flying fox management plan that's been put in place down there. And again, it's been put in place to try and address this very thing, this collaborative, multidisciplinary response to that one wildlife problem.
Okay. Probably time for one more there, Jeff. So Matt's question perhaps on crows.
Okay, we had a large murder of crows that seemed to roost on the aerodrome at night. What is the best way of getting rid of them? No obvious reason that I can see that attracts them. Ooh, crows can be difficult. I suppose you gotta ask yourself the question: what sort of a strike risk are they? And crows, many airports, I see a lot of crows. You see them transiting the airspace regularly. You see them hanging around. And we did a study some years ago on how many birds do you actually see of a species and how often do they get struck. In other words, it's sort of an index of how likely they are to get struck. And crows came out right on the bottom of the list. So you see them very, very often. They don't get struck that often, or they don't cause a conflict that often. So first come off the rank there, your crows. How do you rate them on the risk scale? Are they really, again, a risk to your aircraft operation? If they are, then it seems to me from what you said that the roost site is what they're attracted to, and you probably need to modify the roost site. If you really think they're a risk, you need to work out where exactly they're roosting and remove those roost trees. The other thing you could do is to harass them at night with the appropriate permits, using noise, using maybe lasers, that sort of thing, in their roost site to try and move them on. That's what I can think of off the top of my head without actually examining your specific problem. Thanks, Matt.
Okay, thanks everybody. Some great questions that were raised there, and So we have now come to the end of today's webinar, and a big thank you to Jeff for that very interesting topic that you've covered today. And if you do have any other questions for Jeff, I would recommend you send them through. You probably send them through to him directly. Jeff, if you've got some details that you'd like to provide, is there an info Abbey Shaw email address that they can put that through to?
There's a generic email address on the web, or they can get me directly at, I'll read it out, you can copy it down, JMCKEE, all one word. I'll repeat, JMCKEE at Avisure, AVISURE.com.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thanks, Jeff, and thanks so much again, and thank you to Abbey Shaw as well for your fantastic support today, and as always. And a very big thank you to everyone for dialing in and participating today, and for your great questions that were raised. Just before I do go, we do have a short survey. If you haven't had the chance to fill that out already, it should be on the right-hand side of your screen. But if you can take the opportunity to complete that, that will help us immensely. So thank you again to everybody, and we do hope to see you on our next webinar. Details will be announced through our newsletter in the coming period of time, so just keep an eye out in alert for that. But thank you again, everybody, and thanks to Jeff as well.
Thanks, everybody. I'll sign off now. Bye now.